right, well, hello everyone. Welcome. This is our final session on Book 1, Freedom, Law, and Rights, Chapter 5, and it's called Constitutional Considerations. You know, up till now, we have been examining the meaning of various concepts and the way they fit together in traditional American political order: freedom, law, rights, liberal democracy, civil society. But in this final chapter, we want to go a little bit deeper. And we want to ask ourselves, why did the framers craft the U.S. Constitution in the manner they did? What were their underlying motivations, even their presuppositions? And this question leads us into an area that is deeper than politics or even law or rights or any of the things we've talked about. And that is the very question concerning human nature itself. Think about it. When you're establishing a constitution, or law for that matter, you're asking yourself, you have to, in order to create rules for governing an entity, whatever that entity is, you have to ask yourself, what is its nature? And in political order, we're making rules for the governing of human beings. So it's inevitable that you have to ask yourself, well, what is a human being? What kind of rules are suitable for such a creature as a human being? In other words, you cannot divorce political order from a deeper and more comprehensive worldview, right? A worldview, I'm sure most of you have heard that term before. I think we mentioned it earlier in the course. Worldview is every single person who's ever lived possesses a worldview, a Weltanschauung, as the Germans put it. And this is the set of implicit presuppositions we have about reality, about what existence is, about what human beings are, about why we're here, where we're going, all these questions that are unavoidable for human beings. And at the root of one of this worldview, there is some implicit conception of human nature, of what a human being is. Now, the American founders and framers certainly possessed a worldview, and they certainly possessed a view of human nature. And their view of human nature is what impelled them to create a constitutional democracy, a liberal democracy, one in which the democratic elements, the majority views, were limited by the higher law of the Constitution. There's a reason why their view of human nature is what led them to create a limited government, as we often call it. Now, what was that view of human nature? Well, it's not difficult for us to understand. The American founders and framers and the revolutionary generation and everyone in America who came from England brought with them a view of human nature, one that had been shaped for almost 1,800 years by the Christian revelation. American society, of course, is an offshoot of Western civilization. And Western civilization, up until the 19th century and even into the 20th century, was historically known as Christendom. This was the geographic area where Christianity eventually permeated the society and shaped the consciousness of everyone, and thus led to the formation of various kinds of customs, beliefs, values, laws, rules, economics, politics, and so on. In the case of the framers, they held a particular version, and a very influential one, of the Christian understanding of human nature. And it was the view that we often call an Augustinian view of human nature. That refers to St. Augustine, one of the greatest Christian theologians of all time, who lived from the 4th to 5th century AD. Augustine wrote deeply about Christianity, and his views for 1,000 years were the dominant authority in the development of Western civilization. He wasn't challenged until the rise of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. So the framers held an Augustinian view of human nature. Now, what is that? Any of you who have studied St. Augustine's work, City of God, or other Confessions, other very famous works, they recognize it. Augustine believed, of course, man is made in God's image, endowed with reason and free will, and so forth. But man is imperfect. He is fallen, right? There is original sin. And so there is this deep sense of the imperfection of human nature. And in particular, Augustine said, every human being, and that's everyone, beginning of time to the end of the world, all cultures, all times, all places, every human being has the same nature. Christianity, of course, believes that there is what we call a universal human nature. That is, everybody, as we said, has the same nature. God didn't create, grade A and grade F people. We all have the same nature. And what that nature, of course, says Augustine, is governed by three lusts. It's the imperfection of human nature. Every one of us, Augustine says, is driven by three lusts. The lust for material things, the lust for sex, and most important politically, the lust for power, what he called the libido dominandi. Libido is lust, dominandi is to dominate or to control. Every one of us is driven by these three lusts. And the lust for power, again, is most important politically. Now, the framers, America was a thoroughly Christianized nation, and primarily with Protestantism. Martin Luther was an Augustinian, and many others within that modern Protestant tradition. The framers were decidedly Augustinian. That is, they held a view of human nature that was deeply, deeply, deeply concerned with the problem of the lust for power that governs every human being. Now, how did they know? They talked about it obsessively, and it's not an exaggeration to say that. I mean, the writings are saturated with a discussion of the problems arising from the human lust for power. Sam Adams, the famous New England patriot, said, "Ambition and lust for power are the predominant passions in the breasts of most men." I'm quoting here. And then it goes on, and then they go on to say, quote, "It is the nature of man to be tyrannical." This was a deep-seated presupposition held by everyone in the founding generation. Literally, it was widespread and commonly held American view. Now, how did the framers know that all men are driven by a lust for power? Of course, they had the experience of history. They have seen it again and again, as history shows, the abuse of power by people in government. Their religion told them this, their understanding of the imperfection of human nature and its fallen nature. And also, they were honest. They were moral realists. They experienced it in themselves. And if any of us are honest, we should understand the lust for power, because according to Augustine, we all have it. It's nothing strange, nothing we can't relate to. So what is this lust for power? What's it feel like in everyday experience? The lust for power is the pleasure that human beings take in having other people think or act the way they think the people should act. We don't like it when people think or act in ways that we don't agree with or we don't like. We don't like that. What gives us pleasure is when people conform to think or to act according to how we think they should think or act. That's a very common human experience. And it's very much related to the lust for power, because the morally immature come to the conclusion, well, I don't like how that person thinks or acts, so I'm going to force him or her to think or act the way I think he should. It's a very common human impulse, which is why, as we saw earlier, freedom is so rare in human society, because the use of coercion to force others to think or act the way we want is very, very common, and it gratifies us. So does that mean that we're just condemned never to have a free society because everybody's just driven by a lust for power and keen on forcing everybody else to think or act the way they want to? Well, no. Because even though if we recognize the lust for power in ourselves, which often, by the way, people who are driven by the lust for power are the last ones to recognize that that's what's really driving them. Because we also have the ability to rationalize, or we have imagination, and people tend to dress up their motives in the most self-flattering terms. Human beings can be great self-deceivers. And nobody ever thinks they're doing evil. They always make up some reason that convinces them that they are doing good. All right, so that's a danger. But moral realism requires that we not allow ourselves to be deceived in that manner, and we really look closely at our own motives. And oftentimes, when we say we want to help others or serve others, what we really want is to control them. At least this is the view, the Augustinian view, the view of the framers. They recognized the lust for power in themselves, and they were people of for the most part, very high moral character, who did not act on the lust for power, but recognized it and were honest enough to recognize that this is a universal propensity of man to attempt to exercise his or her lust for power. But as I said, it's not inevitable. We don't have to give into it any more than we have to give in to the lust for material things, lust for sex, and so forth. Because we have the capacity to develop, we've already talked about this earlier, self-restraint, to restrain ourselves, just as we can restrain ourselves from killing and stealing and lying, we can also restrain our lust for power. And how does that work? In the morally mature, it works like this. Just because I don't like what someone else is thinking or doing, I don't have the right to force them, because every one of them has a right to life, liberty, and property, just like I do. And I'm not God. God didn't put me here on earth to force everybody to live the way I think they should live. That's between the individual and God, unless, of course, they are harming the legitimate rights of peaceful people. We've seen that. And so just because I don't like it, who am I to act like I am God and jump in and try to force you to think or act the way I think you should, right? And that's what it means to respect another person's rights. But that requires a certain degree of moral maturity and the ability to exercise self-restraint. Now, the founders believed that such self-restraint could be nurtured in our religious institutions, which was one reason, as we'll see, why they were such strong supporters of strong religious institutions. John Adams says our Constitution is made for a moral and Christian people and none other. Because why? Because it's Ben Franklin. I'm sorry. This was Thomas Jefferson. He said, whatever it may be the case with certain peculiar thinkers, most people accept their morality from their religion. So religion, strong religious institutions are the training ground for developing the kind of morally self-disciplined people who are capable of the self-restraint that is necessary to allow for a free society. Again, that's why freedom has been so rare in human experience. It requires a lot of us. We have to restrain ourselves and not jump in and coerce people or force them just because we don't like what they're doing, or let alone kill them or steal from them and so forth. But of course, as we've talked about, the Ten Commandments were the perfect training ground for such a people, because the Ten Commandments, the morality that deals with our relations with other people, is precisely a morality of self-restraint. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, and so forth. And so the people who were trained in this kind of negative morality were the people whose societies originally developed the free society, which is based primarily on the capacity of human beings to restrain themselves. That's what it means to recognize and respect someone else's rights. Remember, we've talked about this extensively. How do I respect your rights to life, liberty, and property? By restraining myself from murder, coercion, and theft. And the morality of the Bible, biblical morality, was perfectly aligned with that. And so you see this. So we don't have to give in to our lust for power, is the short answer here. We can restrain ourselves and say, just because I want something to be a certain way doesn't mean I have the right to force others to it. As you can see, though, that takes a certain level of maturity, which I'm not sure is all that widespread in contemporary society. All right, but anyway, the framers to a person were convinced that the lust for power is a universal attribute. Now, they recognized it in themselves, and they recognized that it would prevail in all rulers at all times, including those in America. So this is their problem. On the one hand, the lust for power is what causes private individuals to harm each other, right? To violate their rights. So we need, as we saw in Locke and others, we need to have a government that is there to administer the law, to restrain people from violating the rights of their fellow citizens. But that at the same time creates another problem. We have to be sure that this government that we establish doesn't also run wild, fueled by a lust for power, and turn around and use its power to harm the peaceful people, their natural rights to life, liberty, and property. So how do we do that? We already saw in the case of, in chapter 1, that we do it through the rule of law. Private law, which directs the rules of just conduct between private people, and public law, which directs the relationship between the people and the government. And the fundamental documents of public law, there are many, but the chief ones are the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The framers were deeply obsessed with this problem of the lust for power, and the only restraint, the only solution to the lust for power, they believed, was to create a limited government. Even Mother Teresa, or a saint, could not be trusted with unlimited power, precisely because of human nature, because everyone is driven by the lust for power. And power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, said the great classical liberal Lord Acton in the 19th century, but the framers could have said the same thing themselves. And so the problem of human nature and the lust for power is at the root of all coherent systems of limited government. Why do we put limits on government? Because no human being is qualified to exercise unlimited power. That's just the way it is, and that is their deep-seated conviction. And so the skepticism of human nature armed with power is of biblical origin. Augustine didn't make up his theories from whole cloth. He, of course, was a Christian. And you can search the world literature, and the only place you're going to find, especially in the ancient world, any place where you see this kind of skepticism of political power happens to be, any Bible scholars out there, happens to be in the Old Testament. And in particular, the book of Samuel. If you recall, the Israelites they wanted a king to be like all other nations, and they were asking for a king. They were asking God for a king. Samuel consults with God, and he comes back, and he says, well, God says, oh, you want a king? Well, what's going to happen? You want a king? Well, you know what? He's going to take your sons. He's going to take your daughters. He's going to take your vineyards, and he's going to take them all, and your land and your property, and you will be crying to me for this king that you have, and you will cry to me, and I will not hear you, right? There's a real danger here in wanting political power, a king, right? This is unique in the history of the world. Skepticism of human nature armed with power is of biblical origin, and the only places on earth that have established any sort of coherent limited governments did so on the basis of the immersion of Christian inspiration or its transmission to other cultures from Christendom. But the framers were quite clear about this. There was not the slightest equivocation. Lust for power is the predominant passion in the breasts of most men, and in order to prevent its abuse politically, we have to put limits on government. And that's why they created the Constitution in the manner that they did. This problem of lust for power is always in the back of their minds. At the same time, however, they also recognized the framers were, like Augustine, they were moral realists. You know, there's different interpretations within the large umbrella of Christianity, this question of human nature. You had people like John Calvin, that man is naturally depraved, and there's not an ounce of inherent goodness in him or anything like that. On the other hand, you get in the 18th century the Christianized view of Rousseau that man is naturally good, and he becomes evil not by himself but by his institutions. The framers didn't accept any of these extreme positions. They had a balanced and, I think, realistic view of human nature. We can't ever forget that man has the capacity for evil. He is imperfect. That's always an aspect that will always be present in human experience. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that man also has the capacity for good. There have been many, infinite examples of actual human goodness in this world. And with the grace of God, we certainly can aspire toward and enact goodness. So it's not we're all evil or all good. The linchpin of the system is what we've been talking about throughout this semester, is the existence of free will. Right? Man, you can make a choice to pursue the good or to pursue the evil. And with the grace of God, it's hoped that you will pursue the good. So free will and this Christian understanding of human nature is at the root of everything that they did. And James Madison goes on to talk about this balanced view of human nature. He says, if man was just simply, I'm paraphrasing now, but if man was simply depraved, we would have no hope of establishing free government. Because as I said, free government requires a morally self-disciplined people who respect the rights of others. But he said, no, we have to, that's always there. We can't brush it aside, and that's why we put limits on government. But at the same time, we also know that man is capable of good. He is capable of observing the rules that are necessary for freedom and of respecting the rights of other people. And so it is on the better angels of human nature, as he would put it, that we believe the free government is possible. But he has another famous quote that sort of sums up this issue of the problem of government and its relation to the lust for power. He says, and I'm pretty much quoting here, forgive me if I get a word or two wrong, but he says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern man, no government would be necessary. But that is not our condition. In a society where man is governed by other men, experience has taught us that we need to put limits on their power. That's the bottom line. So to again emphasize how this view of human nature governs their entire political structure. As I said, if men were angels, we wouldn't have to worry about it. We could just give the angels unlimited power and forget about it. Or if angels were to govern men, we wouldn't have to worry about it. But that's not going to happen because they sort of invoked Augustine's old statement. Augustine also said, rulers need to remember that they are just men. And like all other men, they are driven by a lust for power. Only in their hands, it's far more dangerous than it is in the hands of the private individual. I mean, you or I may hurt someone in our family or our friends or in a small circle by exercising our lust for power. But remember, government is the organized agent, the collective coercive agent of the community. Government has the prisons, the jails, the dungeons, the nuclear weapons, and the abuse of power in the hands of government is a far greater threat to human existence and human society than it is in the hands of private individuals. And so the framers were deeply, deeply aware of that, and that's why everything they did was directed toward allowing government to have as much strength as it needed to do its legitimate task, that is to secure the rights of each and every individual, but not so much that it could abuse that power and turn it against the very people it's supposed to be protecting. And that's a delicate balance, right? It's a balance between order and liberty. It's not so easy. And we have every reason to be proud of the American contribution to this important development of the free society.